And if you haven't seen the project space yet, you will shortly, and hear more about the artifacts in there. But Heidi Taylor Cottle started here in 2023, thank you. I started 2024. And has really done incredible work with the collection, which is shortly in the process of being made available online.
Very slowly,
but happening now. So she's the community engagement and collections manager. I don't know if anyone's ever been to one of the Talking History programs here, but Heidi's run those. You've probably met her in the past. And it's just a wonderful meeting of the minds here today, so thank you for being present. So I just want to let everyone know that this exhibit is going to be on view through February 21st. And for anyone that knows perhaps a friend or someone who was unable to make it today, who wants to learn more about the show, or if you want to hear even more about the research behind it, Friday, February the 13th at noon Central Time, we're going to have a Zoom program with Sarah, who's on the East Coast. So she'll be speaking more about kind of what you see around you, the plants on view, the histories of the town that she was able to really delve into in order to produce the wonderful works around you on view. Just for anyone that may not have seen it, in the alcove area, so through the doorway head to the shop, you have a checklist of works on view in the main gallery, as well as information and a checklist for the project space. So do take a look at that if you want to take a photo, if you want to take it with you. And just so I don't forget, these zines are free for the taking, and they're about plants, and they're rooted in the Linz Garden. So I will let Sarah explain more about that. I will step off, but I just wanted to again welcome you to the gallery. It's wonderful to see everyone here today. And with that, Sarah, please start.
Thank you, Audra. Hi everyone. Okay, I can't. This is my office glasses. Thank you so much for coming and for welcoming me to New Harmony. I want to do some quick thank yous. I want to first thank Audra Verona Lambert, the curator of this gallery, for her tireless support of all artists, including me. She made anything I asked. She was like, oh, let me send you this reading and maybe this person. She made every connection possible. Literally so tireless. And I'm just so thankful to be part of your legacy. You're a true supporter of artists. So thank you, Audra. And then also, Heidi Taylor Cadill, did I say your name? Yeah, close enough, okay. Thank you so much for your role as the collections manager, meeting with me, taking me through the collections, and facilitating these incredible pieces here. Melora Adams, who I don't think is here, but who is the librarian of the Working Men's Institute, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with because it's a small town. She spent a lot of time with me, like 90 minutes or more, looking through some specific textile artifacts that I'm going to talk about here today that were connected to the work I made. Sylvia Rode, Dr. Rode. Also, thank you very much, Associate Dean at the College of Liberal Arts, Professor of German, World Languages, Culture, and most importantly for my research, Director at the Center for Communal Studies at USI, who shepherded me through the collections at USI, the library. Thank you so much, and gave me some really important research on Harmonist women. Jennifer Green, who isn't here, who is the university archivist, also took the time to take me through the archives. And finally, and most importantly, the whole town of New Harmony. Thank you for welcoming me at every turn. I've never felt so welcome to the town before, so thank you. Yay! So one of the things when you start to research New Harmony from afar, of course, is this legacy of really prominent, powerful, well-known women, right? Fanny Wright, Gertrude Rapp, June Leffer Owens. There's this, it's like such an incredible place because those legacies remain tended to by the town. And as I spent more time here and continued my research, I got really interested in maybe the lesser known women that worked and lived and cared for the community here in Harmony. People who were named or unnamed, whose textile works were in the archives, the women that I imagine that were part of the harmonists who labored in the fields and produced the fine linens, who aren't named but we know about them. So that was one area that I got really interested in. And then I want to make sure, before I talk much more about that stuff, to address the title of the show. It begins with Ella Clymer-Dietz, who I don't know if that name sounds familiar to you. She was the youngest member of the Minerva Society. She was like in her teens. She came to visit her aunt for a season, and the Minerva Society allowed her to come in and join. Apparently it was controversial a little bit. She had to join. And then that means that she also became the oldest living member of the Minerva Society. So in 1904, she wrote a letter to the editor of the Women's Journal, which was a Boston-based suffragette newspaper, to address the fact that the Minerva Society, which we all know, right, was the first official women's society in the U.S., not the Sorosa Society of New York, which got all of the attention. The Minerva Society was founded in 59. The Sorosa Society was founded in 68. So she wrote a letter to this women's newspaper trying to say, rather than complaining and being like, you guys, it was the Minerva Society, she instead wanted to address the importance of the Sorosa Society's large public platform and that we had to kind of all work together to finally establish the right of assemblage for women. Because at this point, there was no right of assemblage. Women couldn't get together, right? That's why the Minerva Society met in private, in homes. So I just want to read this quote for you that includes the title of the show. The announcement, this is her writing, the announcement that a band of women in New York had gathered together to form a society of their own was received with ridicule and scorn. However many clubs may have preceded it, none familiarized the public mind with the idea that women could successfully organize. Many were the predictions of speedy dissolution. Ridicule and criticism, however, were borne with patience and lived down. The way was made plain for others. The thorns were cleared from the path. So I found her kind of cooperative acknowledgement that time and persistence and a lot of different types of representation, including this more kind of famous society, were more important, that people worked together to clear these thorns from the path than having a kind of infighting session about who was the first. And so I really hung on to this particularly salient earthly metaphor of clearing the thorns from the path, because in this time, and I was here in March doing my initial research, we need to remember that even though the path is covered in thorns, which is how a lot of us may feel about our future, I think it's been not super fun to watch all of the civil rights that we worked for last century start to crumble in front of our eyes, right? So, but to remember that these things are cyclical, that we can work together, that thorns can be cleared from the path. And then I just also will say similarly that the well-known women of New Harmony, their fame has supported the lesser-known women, the products of the lesser-known women of New Harmony being preserved. Excellent examples in the back room here. A bracelet that we'll look at momentarily by Sarah Cox Thrall may not have been preserved if it weren't connected to the legacy of this place. I don't know, but that's, an assumption. So I'll just say really quickly, I want to talk about this piece first. It has some elements in it connected to a quilt called the Wig Star quilt that I took a lot of time with Melora in the collection at the Working Men's Institute. I'm not a quilt historian, by the way, so if anyone wants to later pull me aside and tell me I got it wrong, I'm happy to hear it, because I want to make sure it's right. But there was, during that time period, this was not this work, I just made it, but the Wig Star quilt that I based a lot of this on was pieced by a 16-year-old named Josephine Cox right before the Civil War. And in the history of kind of quilt names, there isn't really a legacy that I could find for a Wig Star quilt, but there's a very famous quilt pattern called the Wig Rose quilt, connected to the Whig political party, who were part of the two-party system for the first half of this country's life. And the Wig Rose quilt, and there's another quilt in the collection that clearly is that one. The one that I based this on looks kind of like a made-up pattern, possibly. Was obviously connected to the Whig Party, who, it's important to note, were against executive tyranny, were pro-congressional power. So I thought, okay, that's a good time for us to remember that people in the past have been aggressively against executive tyranny. And I also think that it's important to remember that sometimes domestic crafts, women's work, gets relegated to like the domain of the innocuous. But that sometimes, especially women who didn't have a powerful platform like Fanny Wright, they were making in the domestic sphere, and they still may have had a political position with the work they were making. So this, and so I'll just say one more thing about the Wig Star quilt. The name was written on a scrap of paper by her granddaughter, who donated the quilt. So it also could have been a game of telephone. Maybe she made up the Wig Star quilt. I mean, that's the great thing. Like, there's no rule about what you name your quilt. You can call it what you want. Maybe she wanted to work with star shapes and wanted to align herself with her wig party. So in the talk that I'll give next month, I'll show images of these things, but you can also cruise on over to the Working Men's Institute and ask to look at them. One other note about this quilt, which was really important to me in this work, was that unlike most quilts in the world, many quilts in the collection, quilting is often, I think we all know this, made from scraps of fabric that had been used, right? Very often, especially in the 16th, 17th century, 18th, 19th century, people would, a piece of clothing would wear out, and it would get saved, and it would get integrated into a quilt very often. The Wig Star quilt and the Wig Rose quilts may have been made from used fabrics, but they weren't patterned. They were a plain fabric that had been dyed with plant dyes. So I could identify that one had been dyed with, not here, but in the collection, dyed with madder root. There was a yellow that was probably dyed, there was a bunch of potential plants it was dyed with. There was a green that was dyed. So there's an extra layer of care taken in this quilt, almost like a painting, right, where the colors were specifically chosen. So that sort of led me into the next line of inquiry having to do with people's relationships with plants from this area. I also, I would say I started to get really interested in the women in New Harmony, their labor and care, how they distributed that among their community. I think this is also a time, they're invisible labor, but this is a time when we must be thinking about care and community and their relationship to plant life. In the USI collection, I also saw the Rappite silks that we'll see. Unsure if Gertrude Rapp actually designed them, but an exciting possibility. They look similar to other silks that she designed. And I had access to the Minerva Society documents, as I've talked about. And then that led me to descriptions of the region before the Rappites were here, including descriptions of Indigenous women who harvested and cultivated various native plants to be used for dyeing materials, food and healthcare. So I made this series, I started by making illustrations of some of these select plants, and this work actually takes the star pattern from another piece that was in the Working Men's collection. I illustrated all of the plants. You can see some of them in the scene here. And then I machine embroidered them. So it's like does anyone do machine embroidery here? It's a process where you have to actually make the drawing, and then you have to take it through a strange esoteric software to turn it into stitches, and then you get to stitch it. But now I can make as many as I want. And then the fabric on this was made, the pattern is from a series of needle points that I made. I scanned them, I tiled it into a new fabric, reprinted that fabric, and then fabricated onto this work. And this shape, this kind of star shape here, is my approximation of the stars that were on the Wig Star quilt. So this is the shape, which is not part of the Wig Rose quilt, so that was the part that was either this person's invention or it was a pattern that wasn't really documented. And all of this work and the three behind you are on linen as a kind of ode to the linen production of the Harmonists. It's a labor-intensive, crazy process to make that much linen. The other thing I got to do with Melora was look really closely at a linen work shirt that the Harmonists made by hand that had a series of initials stitched in the corner that then got plucked out and reinitialed, just like the labor that went into the shirt meant that no one, like that shirt was gonna live for generations. We talked for a long time, who were it was probably the initials of the wearer, how did they identify them? I think we probably all have a vision of the Harmonists in their like exact outfit, right? Everyone matches, so how could you tell your shirt apart? Because it had your initials in it. So the labor of producing linen which after the plants were harvested, it's like a multi-step process to even get the fiber to make the thread, was really probably the realm of women, just kind of scuttling and brushing and chopping. So the fact that they had a linen industry and the amount of human labor that went into it was pretty incredibly impressive. So the works, I'll talk about these next just because these are slightly separate, the larger pieces. These three works are all, the embroideries are all hand embroidered, and they're loosely grouped based on the period that the plant would have been here. So this piece is called, this piece is related to the settler colonial period, the pre-Rappite period, and the center plant in here, which is also over there in color, is called cocoon. And it's a plant that grew in the wetlands here that has an orange root that was used to dye a brilliant orange that Native women would have used. This is a jack in the pulpit without its color. Can you visualize a jack in the pulpit, like the purple flowers? Wetlands here. And then I used sunflowers because those were cultivated here. And then a selection of other plants. You can read them in the zine. I won't go through each one. And then this is related to the Harmonist period, and the center plant is borage, which you can find in the lens garden. Do you like borage? It's used to make a tea, and it's anti-inflammatory. It has all these incredible properties, and it's just a really beautiful plant. There's a large print of it right behind you. This is also wild bergamot, and then flax for linen, and wild ginger and some other things. There aren't hard lines around when plants existed, right? Flax was planted here and then it kept growing, or there's still borage being grown today in the lens garden. So I've included, sort of cross-included them. And then over here, this is from the Owen-Maclure period. So we've got the famous golden rain tree in the center. And I also just want to say that the vine pattern is loosely related to a vine pattern that was on the Wig Star quilt and the Wig Rose quilt. So there was I mentioned pretty. And these are made from, these are all on linen too, hand embroidered, and then the collage is made from, I scanned print materials. So there's print material of cells and plants and other things from the 1970s and 80s. I just have a big collection. I do a lot of work with archives. So I scanned those and then printed them onto fabrics and then collaged them so that there would be other kind of more contemporary echoes of time. And then the three sort of large silk banners, I guess, are related to the Gertrude Rapp and the silk scarf industry. Sylvia has an incredible text, Sylvia wrote, where I learned about the Württemberg style of dress, and that, I don't know if you've ever seen them, but the Harmonists, despite their kind of, basic outfits of black and white, the women would sometimes wear these brightly colored, incredible shoulder shawls that were from, is it Swabia region? Yeah, these kind of traditional shawls that often had kind of incredibly bright. I mean, these are dull almost compared to the colors. I would say that the barrage one might be the closest in color with the green, purple, and blue. These incredibly bright, vivid, really contemporary looking colors, including a multi-stripe border. So I'm not trying to reproduce those. I was trying to make my own. These also combine, you'll see the little stars that were from the Wig Star quilt combined into all of them, and they're just sort of an homage to these three different plants. I editioned them a smaller version that you can buy in the gift shop if you would like to. You'd like to have your own. Yeah.
Great.
Does anyone have any questions?
Do you want to give us a segue to how the artifacts arrived to the project space?
Yeah, absolutely. I got to go with Heidi to look through the collections, before coming here, and then in my first few days, I became really interested in these bright sort of scarves and the Gertrude Rapp designs, because when the Rappites left here, they started this incredible silk industry. And the designs that Gertrude Rapp, I was also like, oh, there was a woman from New Harmony who had all this power that seems outside of how they normally operated. The Chicago Art Institute holds several of Gertrude Rapp's designs in velvet and in silk in their collection. So I didn't really understand that she was like part of a design history that was collected at this big public institution. So I was very excited to find these two possible, slightly unknown, we'll talk more about them, but one of the patterns which has flowers in it I clearly recognized as related to Gertrude Rapp's pattern design. So I was so excited, and like Heidi so generously agreed to show them. And then in our discussion about what I was thinking about and researching, she told me about this incredible bracelet that we'll look at momentarily. I wrote a little blurb about why I was interested in it. It was made by a student who was one of the first students in the Owen-Maclure schools. It's this beautiful example of craft. But she also, we have that provided actually on the bookcase in the corner. She, Sarah Cox Thrall, did this incredible oral history of being a student in school that was like, it's like, you know, the schools are this incredible kind of utopian vision for training the working class without gender boundaries, etc. And then there's like this little kid 6-year-old who like is sequestered from her mom and just wants to eat cake. So that's like really, you'll talk more about that, but that was really thrilling to read that oral history.
So one thing that's very interesting is when you have somebody else that selects the 4 objects in a room, you know, if you've been a curator, you're thinking, well, what's the connection between all of these? And I'm not sure if, Sarah, if you had something in mind with saying that you wanted the spinning wheel and the bracelet and the scarves all together. But while you were talking, I was trying to think of what's the connection between these 4 objects. And one thing that I was coming up with is, starting with this spinning wheel, it's called a walking spinning wheel. And the way that you would use it from the medieval time to the mid-19th century, this was something that domestic households would have, you know, to kind of make their own thread. And the reason it's called walking, you would use your right hand to spin the wheel. You would use your left hand to keep drawing the thread back and forth. And it was just a kind of like a constant dance. If you come back here on the label, we actually have a QR code that takes you to a video from a museum in Sweden, where they have some people dressed up in 19th century clothing, and they're recreating what that would have looked like, what that kind of dance would have been. So if you think about this, this is something that people, especially women, were using in the pre-industrial times. And when you compare that to what the harmonists were trying to do and what Robert Owen was doing over in New Lanark with his cotton mills, with their silk industry, they were part of the industrial age. So in looking at that thread through here, we're kind of seeing the transition from you know, what was before the Industrial Revolution, how textiles were made, the labor that went into that versus machinery, and you know, how that was changing around the time of the Harmonists being here and the Owenites. As far as the beaded, well, you know what, I'll go chronologically. As far as the Harmonists go, this has been kind of a puzzle for me. These 2 silk scarves were donated by Jane Blaffer Owen back in 1989. They've not been on public display since then. There was a board meeting when it was accepted into the Historic New Harmony collection. They were displayed that night. They've not been on display since then, as far as I can tell. And one thing that is kind of a conundrum for me looking at these is that it has, this one says George Rapp Economy, that one says Frederick Rapp Economy. And And I just looking at these, I'm like, I don't know why that they would have produced these. Was it for a souvenir? You know, what was the intention between having, you know, the names of the leaders on these? And so talking to Sylvia Rhodes, she actually brought up that they may not have actually been produced during the time of the harmonists working in the silk industry, but maybe later as a souvenir, maybe by Old Economy. We don't know, and I've got to do some more research into this. But it raises an interesting question about how that we actually do history. How do we, you know, get these stories about these pieces that are not traditional art that usually come with a provenance and documentation? A lot of the times we are relying on stories from families, oral histories, just mentions in books, that sort of thing. So this is kind of a mystery still going on. But as Sarah said, these are some patterns that she has seen in other harmonist silks. This is a vermicular pattern that was very common in the 19th century. So these may be evocative of the harmonist silks, but they're kind of a mystery.
Is that hand stitching on it on the sides?
You know, I'm not a textile expert.
It kind of looks like it.
If you want to go look at it, it's
Well, the Art Institute and Hamilton College and some other places have examples of the harmonist scarves, I think, that have a better provenance than what these do. So, you know, that's kind of one of those things that we're going to have to do more research on. And I will say too that in coming up with the labels for these, when you don't really know the provenance of something, even just having to put down the approximate date can be a scary thing. And that's, you know, kind of behind the scenes with museum work. You think of museums as being maybe this like authority on things, and sometimes we're trying to figure out the mystery too, and it's, you know, great to have people in the, yeah, another example of a community. So, and then just moving on over here, this beaded bracelet was, yeah, it's gorgeous. It was made by Sarah Jane Cox Thrall, who was brought here to New Harmony when she was around 7 years old by her father, and she was one of the students in the early Owen-Maclure schools. And Sarah referred to kind of her interview that she had with George Lockwood later for his 2 books on New Harmony, the New Harmony movement and New Harmony community. And apparently she was a storyteller when she was an older woman. People around here really loved hearing her stories about the early days of the community. And again, you know, an example of passing down history through kind of non-traditional means, not official means. But one of the things that she told Lockwood is that when she was a student, they had to eat mush. Like, it was like mush for breakfast, lunch, sometimes they had soup for dinner. Not very appetizing food. And so she said that she would tell herself, when I'm an adult, I'm going to make myself sick just eating cake and sugar. And, you know, that's one of the things when you hear stories like that. I was saying to Sarah and to Audra and Grant the other day that I'm just imagining this, like, 7-year-old, 8-year-old girl who's, like, having to sit here and, like, make this bracelet for the industrial school. You know, the kids were kind of earning their keep, and she's sitting there thinking, I just want a cookie.
Had she ever had a cookie?
I don't know. I don't know, maybe not.
Well, the mush is a convenient way to cook, isn't it?
Yeah. You know, Manfredo Joe, you know, the Neefs, you know, they had to keep expenses down, I guess. But the interesting thing about this is it's one of those objects that we typically have in especially local history museums where you don't have, you know, kind of that extensive provenance with documentation of things. This was donated in 1963 by her granddaughter, I think it was, Bessie Thrall, and she brought with it a story that this was made when Sarah Jane was a student in the Owen Community School, and actually on the back of that frame is the note that's taped on there, and that's our provenance for the piece. So it's another example of those things where we don't always have anything official. We've got to rely on stories, on what's handed down, especially when you're talking about women's work. For a long time, museums were not collecting things like this. And so you have a lot of this out there that can only, we can only use the authority of family lore. Sometimes we, don't know the people that were using pieces like this. This is part of our education collection, the spinning wheel, and we use it in the double log cabin, to kind of illustrate what some of the early settlers here would have been using to make their cloth.